Hey, this is Enaa, in with you in the fight back. And today I want to talk about Mao Zedong and Leon Trotsky on culture. And this is one of a series of videos I've been doing looking at their two ideas on many aspects. And I've done them on the critique of the Soviet Union. I'd like to talk about them both on culture. I'd like to start with Mao. As we know, Mao grew up in a China that was really just coming out of feudal mode of production. There was a revolution when he was but a teenager in 1911, and by his 20s he was involved in the communist movement, and he had quite extensive experience pretty much for the next 50 odd years of his life, from 1920 to his death, and in the theory and practice of revolution. And we have to remember that China in Mao's time was where scholarly knowledge was upheld, manual labor was looked down upon, the peasants were not seen. They were pretty much just spat upon. They were looked on as like human trash. Women were debased and degraded, and if you had intellectual knowledge, you were pretty much separated from the masses. And Mao reacted against all of that. He didn't like this, and as a communist, he was arguing for something else. And although he believed, is the basic Marxist thesis that economics determines the course of history in the last instance, he doesn't just look at the forces of production, the productive forces, as the prime motive. The relations of production, the superstructure, culture, politics, ideology, they have a role to play. These relations, it's in a whole totality, and at the same time that the economic base reacts upon the superstructure at times can react upon the base. So if we look at it this way, when, say, the productive forces have developed to a certain degree, we can unleash man's creativity with changes in consciousness, raising of social consciousness, getting mass initiative in there. And that can, in that sense, the superstructure can react upon the base. And we saw this Mao's ideas of mass initiative, the mass line, which would be put in place during the Enaa period, the Great Leap Forward, and of course the Cultural Revolution. In order for this consciousness to be raised, in order to unleash the productive forces, a lot of the values of the old China, the feudal China, have to be abolished. They have to be condemned. And of course this has to be adopted by the masses on their own. So servility, taking orders, commandism, degradation of women, these all have to be challenged by the masses themselves. The party has a role to play, of course, as both a teacher and a learner in this process, but the masses themselves have to take this up. And Mao also believed that the role of artists should not be to produce works of art. They have a role to play in the class struggle. They should be creating ideas, habits, attitudes, customs, consciousness, and it helps to remold consciousness, to help to wipe away the values and the traditions of the old society. And this idea would of course become prominent in the Cultural Revolution. And Mao is urging for artists not to be separated from the masses as they were in the old China, but to fuse with them, to learn their ideas, to speak of their struggles. And we saw this in the rectification movement in the 40s, and of course during the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. And as China has its revolution in 49, Mao condemns a lot of the bureaucratic commandist practices, this taking orders, giving a fiat, ignoring the masses, this old culture that's in certain ways being reformulated in a new guise under socialist China. He sees as potentially being back to a different road, back on the capitalist road. It will reinforce commandist methods, and he's arguing that we need to have a cultural revolution that will get rid of these commandist ideas in the party, these capitalist roaders, and we can really get politics in command. We can get ideology, the right ideology in there, and we can unleash the creativity of the masses. And this was done during the Cultural Revolution. Unfortunately, after Mao's death, we had a capitalist restoration, and many of the things he condemned did come to pass. But as you can see, Mao was really arguing for, in a sense, a cultural revolution that, under the dictatorship of the proletariat, that would have profound political and social consequences, and economic as well. And that's largely Mao's view, kind of simplistic, but I hope it gives you the basics on that. Leon Trotsky was also interested in culture, and it was a great preoccupation of his. Now, we know Trotsky as one of the chief organizers of the October Revolution. We know Trotsky as the founder of the Red Army. But he was not just concerned with military and political matters in a narrow sense. He was concerned with other things as well, with the revolution, its soul, as it were. So he was concerned with literature, art, education, culture, ideology. And there are differences between him and Mao that I will point out. Now, after the Civil War is ended, and after the Civil War, we know that Russia is largely devastated, and there's great poverty and scarcity, and of course the growth of the bureaucracy, which will later culminate with Stalinist dictatorship. But Trotsky, as we all know, Trotsky believed that Russia desperately needed economic development, industrialization, collectivization. But he was just as concerned with spiritual factors, the cultural factors of the revolution, and he wrote several articles on this called "The Problems of Daily Life," were actually a bestseller in the Soviet Union for a time. And he also wrote "Literature and Revolution," which, if you haven't read, it's actually a real treat to read. And he wanted culture adopted by the masses. He was thinking largely of the heritage of bourgeois culture. I'll get into that momentarily. And for instance, he dealt with many topics in the problems of everyday life: family, enlightenment, unenlightenment, civility, politeness, vodka, religion, cinema, and swearing. So he was well versed in this. He wasn't some dilettante just coming in. And he believed that swearing, for instance, it's a result of despair, that the masses who take it up, they really have no hope or escape from slavery, and it colors the Russian masses, and it creates despicable patterns of behavior, abusive, non-dignified, and of course, those on the top in, say, old Russia, Tsarist Russia, they were also abusive. They swore, and it persisted in Russia. So on the one hand, we have those at the top who are swearing, abusing, degrading those at the bottom, and those at the bottom who, in a certain sense, picking up these habits, swearing, and they're degrading not just it's total degradation of the human personality, and persists in Russia after the revolution. And Trotsky believes the revolution is not just about developing the economy, but it's all really about the awakening of the human personality in the masses. Those who the powerful would say never had personality to begin with, about dignity and respect, solidarity, equality, all of that. And the revolution should uphold women. It should bring social and individual progress to them, and it shouldn't be about abuse. And the revolution needs, of course, to struggle against these old habits, the swearing, bureaucracy, and all that, in order to forge new ideas and new values to get ahead. And yet, if those old conditions were not overcome, they came back with a vengeance under Stalin in new, different forms, of course. And we saw this in the abusive and the commandist party and state apparatus that developed under Stalin that did not have mass initiative at all. There really was no remolding of officials, specialists, and cadre in the party and in the intelligentsia. As the revolution was occurring, many intellectuals, there was a lot of intolerance for the old customs of the masses. And Trotsky, a lot of these should be condemned, the swearing, of course, the civility and all that. And the party was, many in the party were encouraging something called the proletariat culture, or the prolet cult, a class culture that permeated with class consciousness, atheism, internationalism, and all these such values. But Lenin condemned this as well, along with Trotsky. And Trotsky condemned the proletariat culture movement because it tended to settle affairs by command. The party was dictating to the artists, this is the type of way you should produce. So it was about intimidation, command, by fiat. And it was really about making the intellectuals docile to a certain line the party was proposing. And the revolution, Trotsky believed the working class didn't necessarily have all the virtues that a lot of these people were extolling. It wasn't a bunch of saints, for instance. They were permeated with these old ideas that I spoke of earlier. But the revolution does open the way to learning, to culture, to the development of the human personality. And the workers should take control of the heritage of the old society. They should guard it, but of course not indiscriminately. Cultural values of the past should be subjected to criticism and before they're adopted. So in a sense, Trotsky is, I would argue in a certain sense, more appreciative of cultural values of the old society than, say, Mao, but Trotsky also he had traveled much more widely than Mao. He had been all over Europe and the United States. So he's looking at this as a largely European perspective. And he is just as he does condemn these servile attitudes, I would believe, just as much as Mao, but his approach is, as we can tell, rather different. And Trotsky urges intellectuals not just to do this accept these fiats, but they need to remold themselves. They need to change. And in Literature and the Revolution, which is Trotsky's looking at post-revolutionary works that have developed in Russia, he wants freedom of expression for artistic and literary schools. In a sense, as 100 flowers can bloom. And he doesn't think this freedom should be abused by counter-revolutionaries. So he kind of puts a clear demarcation there. And Mao does the same thing as well. And he does see, of course, that lack of respect among the party, these commandist attitudes I've spoken of, and again, the handing stuff down by fiat. And again, he looks at the many schools of thought, the works that have been produced by the revolution. He looks at the emigres who lament the revolution, the whites, the fellow travelers, those who are kind of traveling part with the party, but they're kind of going on their own road eventually. So they're traveling with you part of the way, fellow traveler, which I believe he coined the phrase. And Trotsky actually values their work. He says the ambiguity of it, the social tension, because they're kind of on the fence, it really creates some value. He's not totally praising it. He makes a lot of literary points, and you can read Literature and Revolution to see them all yourself. But he looks at the futurists. He actually got exchanged notes with Antonio Gramsci on this, to be sure. He looks at Alexander Bloch. One of my favorite poems by him is The 12, which you should read as well. But he does refute proletariat culture, and he says it can't exist because the proletariat regime, the dictatorship of the proletariat, workers' democracy, is supposed to be a temporary and transient form. The revolution lays the foundation for a class of society and a universal culture, and because of the transient nature of the proletariat dictatorship, and because they're going to be involved in such fierce struggles with imperialism abroad and economic development, there will not be time for the proletariat to really develop its own culture. And he's also, again, this whole idea of proletariat culture, which the party had really been doing from above by fiat, you really can't do that. It has to be absorbed and done by the masses themselves. And he believes that the art of the revolution is producing now is that of a transitional period, which will later become a universal culture that will be adopted. So the art of this period is still, it's again transitional. It's still finding expression, and Trotsky believes that it must be realistic and sensitive to social reality. Although he wants many schools to contend. And he thinks that communism, once it's developed, once this classless society is developed, it will unleash man's creative passions. And believes that under communism we'll have rich social individuals with rich social needs, very much following in the tradition of Marx and Lenin in this respect. And Trotsky, he ends up underrating the duration of the transition. It lasts for much longer than he anticipates. And we see this also with Trotsky's analysis of Stalinism. It lasts longer than he wants, this whole transitional phase. And Stalinism, again, brings that degradation of culture. And he describes this in The Revolution Betrayed, about retreats in family life, in education, in the arts, in the sciences. He's really condemns that. And although under Stalin, actually, the education level in general goes up, it's really type of almost a primitive cultural accumulation. At the same time that more people can read, a lot of the old czarist practices are coming back. And like Mao, Trotsky was very concerned about this direction the Soviet Union was heading, while Mao was concerned with China. But Trotsky does not urge a cultural revolution per se. He urges a political revolution of the working class to overthrow the Stalinist bureaucracy. Why? He believes that this political revolution will have profound social, cultural, and economic consequences. It'll really be a benefit to the Soviet Union. And Mao, on the other hand, he does see the idea that there is a proletariat culture, there is a strict proletariat line. Although he does want various ideas to contend during the 100 Flowers campaign as well in the Cultural Revolution. But Mao wants a cultural revolution that has political, social, and economic consequences. You can kind of see the differences there. But these two are actually, in many respects, they're operating on this very similar wavelength. And just to actually have them in dialogue with each other, it's really incredible. Instead, again, I don't like this idea of having these two in conflict all the time. They really should be in dialogue, and we really should get past the epithets between them, because if you actually look at these two in dialogue, it's quite fruitful. I hope this video has been rather informative. So this is Enaa. Until next time.